Welcome to Chapter 6, where we'll talk about system implementation and support. So here we'll talk about what we typically go through in that implementation process, and also mention some of those behavioral factors that can really make the difference. And we'll talk about what a kind of a sample implementation plan would look like. And then once again, we'll talk about what can go wrong. And then really the importance of the training, the tech support that's kind of, on the back end of the support, okay? So again, talk about the team, what some of our projects are, how we manage that change, the org and behavioral factors, and then, like I said, that last stage, support and evaluation. Okay, so our implementation team, what's their job? Their primary function is to plan, coordinate. They got a budget, see a typo, sorry, and manage all aspects of that new system. Okay, so we got to have a lot of people involved here, and they're all important. But it's no accident that the text has the second bullet point bolded, that system champion. Okay, and this is that person. This is that overly enthusiastic individual that is our cheerleader, that we can count on, that is 100% on board with the system. We typically want this person to be pretty high up in the organization. When I would do this, I liked it to be a clinician, preferably a physician, a DO or an MD, just because they are very influential within the organization. And honestly, I would try and find a quote informal system champion in every key area of the organization. So I would want a doctor, I would want a nurse, I would want someone from lab, pharmacy, radiology, scheduling, surgery, you name it. I wanted them all that were 100% sold on this idea to help get others on board. Okay, I need a project leader / project manager. I need like I said, those key individuals from those areas that will focus on the new systems. Like I said, each of those key departments. And like I said, I would want one person from each area to kind of be my rah-rah cheerleader, if you will. I need representation from the vendor. And then I also need IT expertise from a multitude of areas. I need, expertise on databases, expertise on servers, on printers, the whole gamut is necessary here. So again, like I mentioned in the last lecture, the importance of defining the scope and the goals is pivotal here. We've got to be sure we all know what success looks like. And not to go down a rabbit hole here, but and part of this is when we also define when payments take place, okay? I'll give you a sneak peek. The vendor always wants date-based milestones. So when the calendar hits this date, no matter where we are in the project timeline, I'm cutting a check to the vendor. Okay. Whereas the vendor, rightfully so, or excuse me, the client, the hospital system, always wants milestone-based payments. So you're not getting your next payment until the database is configured. You're not getting the next payment until we've made it through user acceptance testing, so on and so forth. Okay. So then we identify who's on the hook for this, who's accountable for completion of the project. Who are the people that come together and say, yeah, we're done, and they agree. We build a project plan, a reasonable project plan that both the vendor and the health system can support, okay, from a resourcing standpoint. Okay, so some of the things we do in this process, we look at the workflow, we look at, how we're going to install the system, how do we train people? And in a hospital, I got to tell you, this is incredibly challenging to do. You've got people with different skill levels. You've got people that work different schedules. You've got full-time people. You've got part-time people. You've got everything else in between. How do we convert? A lot of times with these systems, we're turning them on at 1 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night so that it's minimally impactful to the organization. How do we communicate it? How do we prep for it? And then we have to agree on the downtime procedures. So, and most importantly, how long we're going to be down. When I used to do this, we would start months in advance negotiating with the hospital for how long we could take the system offline. And, we would always want as much time as possible. Of course, the hospital would want as little time as possible, and we'd meet somewhere in the middle. And it was usually contracted in there that if we didn't get the system turned on and back to the hospital in a certain amount of time, that we would have to pay them some form of penalty. I'll also add that it's important to consider environmental factors when we do this, because that can play a huge role. So for example, we were going to convert a hospital in Lawrence, Kansas, and we were going to take their system offline and upgrade them. we failed to identify an external factor, and thankfully somebody caught it before we did. The night we were going to take the system offline was the night of the KU K-State basketball game at Allen Fieldhouse in Lawrence. Huge rivalry, and usually results in increased traffic into the ER. So we got to the week of the project go live, and someone on the hospital side said, hang on a minute, there's a pretty significant basketball game going on that night. So we rescheduled it. Okay. So when we look at the workflow process and analysis and design, we look at how we can improve the workflow, how we can make things easier, how we can eliminate any redundant tasks, get better at what we do. But most importantly, we're looking for efficiencies here. How do we make the users happy, but also accomplish the same goal? And one thing that always comes into question here is, do we alter the existing process to fit the software? Or do we alter the software to fit the existing process? And the answer is it depends. Your clinical staff always want you to alter the software to fit their process, whereas us IT people tend to want it the other way. At the end of the day, when you can alter the process, or alter the software to fit the process, that tends to work out better, but that's not always the case, okay? I love that the text mentions here we should kind of be careful about just automating an outdated process. Now's the time to look at those processes and don't get caught in that trap of because we've always done it this way. One way to make this smoother is, of course, to get your end users involved in that process, which helps a great deal, okay? So we start installing, we put in the hardware, we put in the software, we put in all of our network infrastructure if we need it. If we need to interface to we'll call a foreign system, we'll build those interfaces at this time. This is when IT does the bulk of their work, okay? One way we can do this is a pilot, okay, or what we call incremental go live, okay? So we're going to test it with one department maybe, okay? So one popular way I've seen this done is, hey, we're just going to turn the system on in radiology first and see how that goes. Or we're just going to turn it on for the second floor, okay? That's what we call kind of incremental or phased, as opposed to the other way that we call big bang. And it's exactly what you think. We turn it on all at once. And that is complete pandemonium in the hospital. Everybody is stressed. Everybody's trying to learn a new system. When you do this, you have to do a couple of things. You have to be sure you have a ton of supporting resources on site to help your users just get through their day-to-day. But then we also strongly recommend that you reduce the load of patients that the hospital has overall, but then also the amount of patients that you expect your care providers to see. So if a nurse would normally cover 4 patients, we want to reduce that down to 3. If a doctor would see 5 patients an hour, we want to reduce that down to 3 or 4, okay? The good news about Big Bang is you have 2 weeks of pretty much living hell. But after 2 weeks, things start to get better. If you're doing a phased approach or incremental, the good news is you learn every time, and each next unit or department you turn on gets a little bit smoother. But you can be in this process for months. So pros and cons to each, so you got to really think through it, okay? How do you train the people? Well, I love the fact that the book mentions timing is everything, because it really is. What I used to hear when we would turn these systems on is, yeah, we got trained for this 8 months ago, and we had to keep using the old system, so we forgot everything, okay? We've got to provide as many opportunities as possible. We've got to decide, do we want to do a train the trainer approach, where we create super users that know more, but they continue to do their day job? So a great example of this is we'll have a nurse super user that he or she sees less patients. So if they normally see 4, they'll see 2. And then they'll spend the rest of their time helping other nurses learn the system. And it's really that, just in time type of help where, oh, hey, Dan, you got taught how to do this. How do I, chart a titrated dose? Okay. And that other nurse that's been trained up on it will pause and go, okay, let me show you how to do it. Some organizations even go a step further with this, and to make it even more apparent, they will put that super user nurse in a different color scrub top, so he or she is easy to pick out, okay? So you got to have a clear path. Who do we go to for questions? How do we get help? Staff the help desk with extra people, a lot of things you got to do. When we convert the data from the old system to the new, usually. Sometimes we'll do a cutoff and say, okay, any patient that is admitted after January 15th will be on the new system. If you need anything for the old, prior to that, you got to go to the old system. Okay. If we do convert, some things we need to do, be sure our data is complete, it's accurate, and it's current. And then we go through a whole bunch of validation checkpoints to be sure it's right. And again, you cannot test this enough to be sure it's correct. Okay. Like I said earlier, communication is where things oftentimes tend to go awry. Have a communication plan and be sure we communicate progress on the regular. One of the worst situations I went into, we had turned on a new hospital, and overall it was going fairly well, with the exception of we were experiencing some performance problems. Just the system was moving just a little bit slower than we wanted it to. Users were complaining, they were getting frustrated, the help desk was getting a lot of calls. The CIO that was leading the project on the hospital side was always really good about communicating out good things. Every time things went well, he was real quick to push a publication out to the entire organization and say, here's what we've done really well. But for 4 days, we had this issue with system performance, and he wouldn't push out anything. And we said, you've got to communicate to your users. And he says, I have nothing to share. We haven't fixed the problem. So yeah, that's fine, but you need to let them know we're working on it. You need to let them know we have resources allocated. And finally, we were able to figure out the issue, fix the performance. And then, of course, he was very quick to push out a message and say, okay, we fixed the performance issue. So not the best way to do it. So when we're ready to go live, some of the things we got to do, be sure we're ready. Be sure everybody's trained up. Again, be sure we've got all the policy and procedure in place. What we don't like to talk about, the text calls it disaster recovery. I used to call it the rollback plan. We have to have a contingency plan in place that if for some reason everything just goes haywire, how do we recover from it? Okay. And it might be we go back to the old system. In some cases, it's we go to paper until we figure it out. There's a number of ways that we do it, and we don't like to talk about it, but we've got to have that contingency in place. Okay. So like I said, we got to have our downtime procedures. When we take a system offline to upgrade it, and we agree ahead of time when the system comes down, how long it's going to be down, and exactly what we are going to do, that is what we call a scheduled downtime. The inverse of that is an unscheduled downtime. And that's where, oh my gosh, the system's down. Why is it down? What happened? We didn't plan on this. We've got to figure this out. All hands on deck, fix it quickly. Then it's, of course, managing the change, okay? Everyone has to be bought into the vision, especially your leadership. We have to articulate why we're doing this, what the benefit is. And ultimately, if this does not come back to better patient outcomes, improving efficiency, and making the health system a safer place, we're doing it all for the wrong reasons. And if we can't articulate this, then maybe we're not bought into the vision. So it is very much a system based on trust, where the organization, especially your individual contributors, they have to trust that the leadership has their best interests at heart. Okay. It's worthwhile to incentivize. Okay. Get people excited about the new system versus this panic and chaos that might come with a new system. And then, of course, that if possible, that extrinsic part of it, how do we provide bonuses and, all of that recognition for what people have gone through. Okay. Like the text says, again, we've got to be prepared for the change. We've got to have resources. We've got to have accountability for what goes on. And like I said earlier, problems will happen. There is just far too many moving pieces and parts with these projects. And one of my vice presidents that I used to work for, once we would finish a project, he would always want the debrief. And he always opened the conversation with what went wrong and how could we do it better the next time. And I really liked that culture that he provided, because he knew something was going to go wrong and he was never upset that something went wrong. He just wanted to know how we could learn and grow from it. Okay. So very important in this. There is the behavioral side of it as well. And there's books and books and books written on this, but again, it goes back to a couple of things: communication and culture. Okay. You are going to have users that are not a fan. Okay. And some of them are very challenging to win over. Some of them you may never win over. I remember the cardiologist I was working with that he was not on board in any way, shape, or form. He wanted nothing to do with it. He was not at all invested in it. And upon talking to some of his peers, I found out that every single time the hospital took on a new system, he had the same attitude, and he would eventually come around. Now, what I later learned was he was less than a year away from retiring, so he could care less. So he barely learned how to use the system just so he could get by, so that he could quickly retire not long after. There are unintended consequences. Like I said, there's often, more work, also new work that comes with the system, unexpected things with workflow, the emotions that come with it. Okay. When I used to do end user support for these things, we would go and we would stand side by side with some of these clinicians, and they would have just a great deal of frustration. And sometimes it was just a matter of listening to them and kind of taking the time to, talk them through it very calmly. Sometimes you would have to talk them through the same task 5 times. It wasn't that they weren't smart. It's just they were under a lot of stress. There's a lot of anxiety with the new system. So, and they depend on these systems quite a bit. So change is tough, even if they're on board. Okay. So from an organizational standpoint, we have to be sure we've got the resources in place, the training in place, and a good relationship with the vendor. Okay. And there's a lot of different ways we can go about that. What I saw evolve in the time I did this was a significant increase in the number of checklists we used, okay, just to prepare us for these things, to be sure the organization was ready, the people were ready, the environment was ready, everything. I mean, there's so many things that factor into this, and it's amazing what can agitate people. So we move into the support and evaluation stage. This is what I talked about in an earlier lecture, where this is where we kind of hang out until we're ready to pick a new system again. So this is where we're in constant monitoring for how the system is doing. Do we need to make changes? This is when we upload software patches to fix any issues. These issues might have come right after the upgrade, or it can be 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years later, we find an issue. I remember years ago, we had systems that had been live for over a decade, and we just happened to come across a new issue with daylight savings time that we had to write a patch for. Once we get people functional in the system, then it's time to get into the granular level and start to look at how do we provide additional training? How can we further enhance our workflows? Is there a new feature, new functionality, things we can do to make it even better? And it's just this path of continuous improvement. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the implementation team, talked about some of the activities and the different projects that take place to kind of frame the big picture, how we manage that change, and then those organizational behavioral factors. And then, like I said, that last stage where we hang out in support and evaluation until we're essentially got the new system on. And then, of course, it starts all over again. So that concludes this chapter. Let me know if you have any questions.